Good morning, all. Delighted to have you here, and particularly happy to have Andries Odendaal here. And Marty, welcome. And our two commentators, Chris Mitchell and Jackie Wilson. This morning's topic is celebrating a book that USIP is launching, A Crucial Link, Local Peace Committees and National Peacebuilding. Andries Odendaal authored this book in large part while he was here as a senior fellow at USIP back in 2009, 2010. I had the great pleasure of working with him and watching his work develop over time. When he came on and the Jennings Randolph Fellowship Program selected to bring him here, his proposal was a bit of an outlier. At that time, there was really nobody around town talking about local peace building. It was really quite pioneering, quite innovative, and very exciting. For my part, I was working on the issue of Colombia, and I was seeing a lot of local peace building going on in the absence of a national peace process. So some of the questions that he was raising were really very informative and formative in my thinking about Colombia, about the importance of nurturing this local level of capacity building, even when there wasn't a peace process at the national level, but thinking that at some point there would be, and that it would be important to have invested in the resources at the local level in anticipation of that moment. But I think that much of his work is really groundbreaking, and I think will serve many conflict zones well, because it gives a lot of food for thought about how to look at the linkages, how to assess where to best provide support, both before, during, and after a peace process might be in effect. So I'm going to introduce Andries briefly and then turn it over to him, and then I'll introduce our commentators afterwards. Andries is currently a senior associate at the Center for Mediation in Africa at the University of Pretoria. He's an independent conflict transformation specialist. He's worked for many international agencies, particularly the UN, on this work. And his work has really included many areas around the world: Nepal, South Africa in particular, his native South Africa, Ghana, I believe, Nicaragua. He has many case studies within this book, and I'll let him talk a bit more about that. He was regional coordinator of the Western Cape Peace Committee in South Africa, and he's on the roster of the Bureau for Crisis Prevention and Recovery at the UNDP. I think one of the things that he brings to his topic is also having managed a local peace committee and having helped foster these local peace committees. So he has a real sense of what the challenges and issues are for actually operationalizing an idea of local peace building. But he's also very familiar with the national level and the national peace structures and infrastructures for peace. So without further ado, welcome, Andries, and we'll look forward to learning from you.
Well, thank you very much, Ginny, and good morning to all of you. It's obviously a great moment for me to be here with you. I feel very privileged. In fact, this is great. And I want to thank the U.S. Institute of Peace very much. And I think this Jennings Randolph Senior Fellowship Program is one of the smartest things that I have been engaged with in my life, and it's obviously I have personal interest in saying this, but I think also in general I found that the logic of this program, what it intends to do, what it achieves, is really very impressive, and I sincerely hope that the program will continue to build on the considerable reputation that you already have established for yourself. So thank you to the Institute. Thank you also to the individuals who at the time really made life for me a very pleasant experience. And that includes you, Ginny, who has been my first mentor. It includes Lily, who took over from you once you left. It includes fellows like George and others who really helped me and who really stimulated me along the road. And a whole group of friends and colleagues around me who helped me on this way. I'm deeply grateful. My wife, I can't talk about her here because then I get choked up, so I won't do that, but I'm very glad that she's here. The story of the book the book is really rooted in my own experience and my own struggles, and it is a result of that. You know, in 1992, end of 1992, I was at the time teaching at a college, campus of a college, university college in South Africa. A black campus at the time. This was still the heyday of apartheid, and it was a black campus, and we had conflict on the campus. We had very little else, but we had lots of conflict. And it was truly an experience that helped me or that got me involved in conflict. By the end of the 80s, I was introduced to this field of conflict resolution and immediately attracted to that. And by 1992, I found myself appointed as the coordinator of the regional, or the Western Cape Regional Peace Committee, and that made me responsible for overseeing the establishment of local peace committees and supporting those local peace committees in South Africa. And this was the time of transition in South Africa. And it was an extraordinary time. It was a tumultuous time. It was, and there was no precedent that we could follow. We just had to do what we could do by our instincts. So a very tense time, but a very gratifying time, because I believed and I had the sense that I was doing something that was meaningful and that was making a contribution to the transition in South Africa. Soon after that, in 1993, 94 actually, when we had our election, the whole peace infrastructure was disbanded. But me and a colleague of mine, we decided that this is such a nice model, this is such a good model. We thought that we have to continue experimenting with it. And so for the next 3 years, the two of us continued to work in the very same communities where we have been worked as part of the peace accord structures, trying to do the same thing, getting a group of people together who we considered, we have selected them as potential key insider mediators, representative of the different sides. We provided them with expert training, intensive training, and we thought that they would just continue with the type of work that we have done under the Peace Committee, under the Peace Accord structure. And it didn't work, and for the simple reason that these structures that we're busy now, they lacked the authority, they lacked the mandate. Whereas in the past, I could knock on the door of the mayor and say, Mr. Mayor, I believe we have a problem that we need to work on. I need your attention, please. And he then would give his attention. Now I can knock on his door and say, Mr. Mayor, I need your attention. And he says, who are you? Why should I listen to you? You've just become one of the many NGOs that are troubling my life. So that lesson was learned. It was a fairly painful lesson. A couple of years later, I became involved in Lesotho, in a district in Lesotho, at the request of the district secretary of a district in Lesotho called Mafeteng. And there was no local elected council in Lesotho. It was the district secretary was a political appointment, and he was a top bureaucrat and top political authority in the district, a one-man show in that district. But there's lots of conflict in the district, especially at times when the miners come back for around Christmas. Then they settle all their local scores, and then there's lots of violence and sometimes death. So the district secretary wanted us to help him with conflict in his district. So we went through the whole process again and basically established a local peace committee, representative of all the factors, all the sectors. We trained them, we prepared them. And then in 1998 came the big, I don't know if you know the story, but in 1998 there was an election, and the opposition rejected the election. There was violence. The capital city, Maseru, was looted, was burned down, and two adjacent towns, one of which was Mafeteng, this very town that I was working in. The business sector of the town was burned down, looted. Massive shock to the system. And soon after that, I met with this group, and we sat for 3 days. We did a thorough analysis of what went wrong here, what is happening here, what is it that we should do. We designed our strategy, all of that, and presented it to the district secretary, and he said, no, you are not going to do this over my dead body. And that was the end of it. So there I was, and I had to reflect back. So this thing of local peace building, clearly one of the big dilemmas is its relationship to power, to authority. So in the peace accord structures, we had national authority. We had a strong national mandate to do what we were told to do, and it worked. In our own attempts to do it NGO style, we had no authority, and it didn't work. Here in Lesotho, we had too much authority. We were much too close to authority, and that also did not work, because the moment when we needed our bit of leg room to do what we wanted to do, it wasn't there. It wasn't available anymore. So to my mind, at that stage, it was clear that the recipe that works is if you have a strong national mandate for local peace building, but in a manner that guarantees sufficient leg room, sufficient space at the local level for the local committee to do its own work, not to be constrained too much by control from politicians. A couple of years after that, I found myself in Nepal. I was asked contracted by AED to help the Minister of Peace and Reconstruction to design a implementation plan for local peace committees. It was part of their it also part of their peace agreement that they will have these peace committees at local level. And whereas the political actors collaborated and they had no problem, there was a strong resistance from certain sectors against this very idea. From some of the donor community, from some of these academics and local NGOs. And I couldn't quite understand the resistance, and I think it had to do with some of the local dynamics and the tensions between these actors. But the argument that I heard there and that was thrown at me time and time and again was, show me good comparative research that demonstrates that these things work. Then I'll begin to take you serious. Until that time, you are just it's a South African solution that you want to come and impose here on Nepal with American money. Now that apparently is a combination that is very dangerous, and it's so. Then AED contracted me and asked me to write that comparative report, which I did. But that was the beginning, and that was the time when I decided now is the time to apply to USIP, because now I have something that I want to work on. So I'm very grateful after this long story, rooted in experience. In the meantime, so I'm really grateful. It's a long trip, but I believe this is also important to understand the background of the. Oh God! Now I must press buttons here, and then things will happen. Am I pressing the wrong button? Ah, there we are. And if I want to go back. So after all these experiences, the main argument that I came to USIP with this main argument that a local peace-building strategy is a necessary component of national peace-building, a necessary component. And this is an argument at the time that was controversial. And it's not really controversial because no one really talked about it. It was an argument that was a non-argument, really, that local peace-building is a component of national peace-building. But furthermore, that the national design should contain measures to facilitate implementation at the local level in a manner that values local ownership and agency. And that is the critical second part. That was the argument that I wanted to pursue in this book. However, I found very soon, when I started with my research, I found that I'm up against an assumption, and this is an assumption not only in mainline academic circles, but also assumption under policy, people who make policy, people who implement peace-building strategies or who design peace-building strategies. And the assumption is that peace will trickle down. More or less the same that you have in economics. You know, wealth will trickle down in some mysterious way from the rich to the poor. You must just trust it and it will happen. So in the same way, there's this belief that peace, once the political elites have made peace at the top, that peace will in the same mysterious way trickle down to the local levels. And therefore local peace building is really not, it's not important. The book of Stover and Weinstein, for example, Eric Stover and Harvey Weinstein, I think is an excellent book. I really have great admiration for this book. It's a book that has 4 years of research. They did their research in Rwanda, in Bosnia and Croatia, and they looked at the reconstruction of communities in the aftermath of violence. And they came up with this what they call an ecological model for social reconstruction. Now, this is a good model. Don't get me wrong, this is a very good model. And it says things like, you have it there, establish security, freedom of movement, rule of law, providing access to correct information, facilitating meaningful justice, education, economic development, facilitating cross-ethnic engagement. All of that is fine. But what I miss in this model is there is no room anywhere for a mechanism at the local level that will galvanize and that will leverage or facilitate local agency and local ownership of the peace-building process at the local level. All of this must happen at the national level. It's a national policy that has to be designed. It's national policy that has to be put in place. I do not deny for one moment the importance of the national policy. But it's not going to trickle down. In some cases it may trickle down, but definitely not in other cases. So I soon discovered that I have to develop an argument for local peace building. Why is local peace building necessary? I remember very early after here we had a round table where I tried to sell my ideas, and around the table was a combination of the NGO types like myself, and then the real serious political scientists and sociologists and anthropologists and so on. And we sat around the table, and very soon this became a sort of a referendum on local peace building, with some of them very enthusiastically saying, I believe in local peace building, and the other says, no, I am skeptical, I'm not convinced, I'm not convinced. And it was clearly a matter of faith, do you believe it or don't you believe it? So I realized we need strong arguments. Actually, we need a strong theory for local peace building. Now, I haven't developed that theory, but two arguments, I believe, are very important. The first argument is that local peace building is necessary because local dynamics, personalities, and histories co-determine the nature of peace building. And I was very much, I took cue from the book of Status Kalivas, who investigated the use of violence in civil war. And the conclusion that he came that violence in civil war is never a simple top-down matter. The national cleavage, as he talks about it, the national cleavage does not get copied exactly down to the lowest level. People at the lowest level collaborate in the violence. They take part in the violence, they make use of the violence, but all of them make use of the violence for all of their own reasons and in their own interest, and not necessarily because they have bought into the main ideological narrative that explains the conflict. And that correlated with my own experience, because everywhere where I went in a post-conflict situation, you find from district to district that the dynamics differ. And yes, it's the same overarching conflict, but the way that conflict struck home in this district is different from the next district and from the next district. So you need to give attention to the way in which the conflict has played itself out at the local level and understand the local dynamics if you really want to peace. Because you will find that in some cases the peace trickles down and people are happy, but you will always, in every situation, you find these specific towns like Jos in Nigeria, like Gaur and Kapelbastu in Nepal, the Terai in Natal, the Midlands in KwaZulu-Natal, Londonderry in Northern Ireland, etc., etc. You find these local places that seem to be resistant or oblivious to the national peace agreement that has been signed and just continue to function. So that is the one argument, because of local dynamics, personalities, histories, because they co-determine the nature of both violence and peace. And therefore you need a focus on local peace building. Althusser, in her book on the DRC, made a startling statement. She said that the peace building project in the DRC failed because of inattention to local conflicts, which is quite a strong statement. The second argument, I believe, why local peace building is necessary is because after violence, there are specific conditions at the local level that need and that deserve specialized attention. And let me just quickly mention them. There are three specific conditions at the local level that need attention. The first one is there's a high potential for violence at the local level. And the reason is basically because control is weak. During the war, the rebels were controlling this village and the government was controlling that village, and the control was strong. They had control over the villages. Now there's an agreement. There's a peace agreement, which inevitably means that the control weakens. It's not possible to have the same form of control anymore over the region. So you find at the local level, you find people confused. They don't know who to listen to. There's no strong local government in place. Nothing is strong. In fact, everything is in chaos. And that is a condition that invites violence. 4 types of violence, in fact. The type of violence is not the same. Some of the violence is initiated from the top. I was in Tripoli a couple of years ago, Tripoli in Lebanon, some time ago, and at the time I was there, 7 people were killed, cold blood. Everyone I talked to, and I talked to people across the spectrum, said, this has nothing to do with Tripoli. This is a message that was sent. It's a national message. It's an SMS sent, or a Twitter account, or whatever, that was sent by somebody from the top. Because the Prime Minister came from Tripoli, that was going to be inaugurated in Tripoli, in that town, in that week. And someone was unhappy with his appointment, and the message that was sent to him was sent in the blood of 7 people. As brutal as all that. So that's the one type of violence that can easily occur at the local level. It's initiated from the outside. Another type of violence is opportunistic, what Charles Tilly calls the violence specialist. And we talk here about the mini warlords, local guys who see this situation of flux and uncertainty as an opportunity to establish his authority or his control over certain resources and so on. Opportunistic criminal. The third type of violence is, and this is the more serious one, rooted in local conflict. Because local people engage in the civil war often because they want to pursue their local conflict at higher levels. Kalibas uses the concept, they plug in. They plug their conflict into the national conflict, and now they have more power to drive their conflict. So when that is unresolved, the unresolved local conflicts in this context of weak control, often those conflicts continue to play themselves out violently. And then lastly, sporadic violence that just happens because, you know, the brawl effect. The bar, you go to the bar, people, tempers flare, and there's a brawl, especially around events and so on. High potential for violence. Secondly, a deficit in social cohesion, because violence ruptures the social cohesion of a community. Violence ruptures also or disturbs or disqualifies the old ways of doing things, the old ways of managing conflict, the traditional mechanism. So in this new context, after the violence, where do you go to if you have a conflict? Do you go to the police? Do you go to the courts? Do you go to the chief? Where do you go? Because all of these have been discredited because of the conflict and the violence of the past. So often the rules of the game are not clear. The rules of how to find justice, those rules are not clear in the aftermath of violence. And thirdly, the high emotional quality of local conduct. And I think this is the one point that people at the top don't get very easily. But the fact is that at the local level, when the guys up there have made peace and said, okay, you down there, now we have made peace, so please go ahead, you also make peace. It means that in fact I have to go and shake hands with the man who has raped my wife or who has raped my daughter. Or I must go and sit in a meeting with a guy who has killed my father or brutalized my son. That is what must happen, because most of the violence takes place between people who know each other at the local level. That is the nature of civil war as we know it today. Back an instruction from the top that now you guys there must make peace and live and live nicely with each other from now on. It is utterly naive, and we've seen it now, for example, in the former Yugoslavia, where the peace that has trickled down from the big Versailles or wherever they made the peace accords after the Second World War, the peace that descended on Croatia, we have seen how those wounds that never healed, how they exploded again with the viciousness that left us all bewildered 30, 40 years later on. So an underestimation of the deep emotional quality, the trauma of people at the local level that they had to live through, and without leaving them without mechanisms to deal with that trauma is not helpful for building peace. Okay, so now the question is, so a local peace committee that is now embedded in a so-called infrastructure for peace, is that the answer? Because what are we looking for? We are looking for a mechanism at the local level that can prevent violence. We're looking for a mechanism that can build consensus on the rules of the game, the basic rules of the game. We need for a mechanism that can deal with the trauma of communities in a fairly effective way. Is this the answer? The local peace committees. Now, what is the local peace committee? As you see there, it's really three main sectors of the community coming together: the political sector, the political parties, civil society. And by civil society, I do not in the first place mean the NGOs. I mean those who present an alternative voice in the community. Your religious leaders, or religious communities, the traditional communities, women leadership, women organizations who can come with a credible women's voice, labor, whatever the case may be. From civil society, and then local government, the local police, or what is left of them, to come together in this little red space there. And that space is, the word committee is misleading. It's not a decision-making space. It is a forum, it's a platform for dialogue. It's a space where these people can come together and talk together and decide how to go forward to deal with our most urgent reconstruction needs in the aftermath of all this. So the question is, do they help? And this is what I went to explore in this book. I used two criteria to select infrastructures for peace that I looked at. The two criteria are: one, the peace infrastructure has been established through a national agreement that has involved the most important stakeholders of a peace process. So this, I think, is one important ingredient. There has to be a national consensus, a national mandate for this work. And the second, the peace infrastructure must provide for structures, for local structures, to implement the peace objectives that have been agreed to. Now, I could identify 11 such peace infrastructures across the world. Now, not all of them, some of them you need a little bit of faith to get them to fit in. But on the go, and then a couple of others that are almost there, but not quite. So clearly this is a phenomenon. This is something that is happening, and it is happening, and it is not really receiving much attention. Quick conclusions, and then I'm through. Just to share with you what did I conclude from my study of these 11 cases. Firstly, methodology matters. The way in which an LPC goes about its business is very important. And the main business of an LPC is consensus building. The tools of an LPC is to facilitate dialogue, to mediate, but not to decide, not to judge, not to hand out punitive justice, not to try and govern. If the local peace committee is going to try and establish itself as a power broker, as an exercising power, it sets itself up for political capture. And sooner rather than later, a political party will try to capture it and control it, and that will be the end of it. But as long as this LPC can stick to its task of facilitating dialogue, mediating negotiations, then it has an opportunity to steer fairly clear of political capture. Because political capture is the main threat to this whole enterprise. So that is the one conclusion, that methodology is very important, very, very important. Secondly, I think there's sufficient evidence that that LPCs in this manner contributes to social cohesion, especially when it enjoys local legitimacy. And the local legitimacy is important. If the LPC is established by decree from the top, And where local people are just going to follow the instructions, it will have very little impact. I spent a long day in Nepal one day with the top bureaucrats in the system there, discussing all of this with them, and really emphasized the point that, you know, it's very important how you establish these LPCs. People must be consulted, you must talk to every single party, one-on-one, consult with them, deal with their fears, deal with their concerns, clarify everything. Then they must come, each one of them, with a mandate from their specific constituency, come to the table and say, yes, we have decided that we want to form an LPC. Please do not just send faxes to the district office and instruct them to establish LPCs. Now, one of these honorable principal secretaries was, I think, asleep and just woke up when I said this last sentence, because he went from there and he faxed instructions to all the DCs, go and establish LPCs immediately. Here, this is and before we knew, 36 LPCs were on their feet, and they flopped. They flopped spectacularly because they lacked local legitimacy. It's just a bureaucratic exercise, complete lack of political legitimacy at the local level. So that's very important. If an LPC that has local legitimacy, that has a mandate from local constituencies to do this work, they can make a significant contribution to social cohesion. LPCs, as far as violence prevention is concerned, they are vulnerable to violence that is stimulated from external sources. They're also vulnerable to opportunistic violence, the violence specialists. They are not peacekeepers. They are not armed. They cannot defend themselves. So they are vulnerable to this. But in cases where violence is threatening because of a local dispute, then an LPC can prevent violence by mediating an agreement that will solve and that will reduce the tension in that local dispute. And there are many examples of this happening. So in this way, LPCs contribute to the prevention of violence by mediating local disputes and dealing with the tensions that exist at the local level. Fourthly, the success of LPCs is related to the fact that an inclusive group of local leaders receive the mandate and responsibility for peacebuilding. This is, I think, critical. You know, we are all very good human beings. We all want to contribute to the good things. But there are very few of us who, when we see that there is a violent incident brewing there, who's going to go there and say, okay, guys, now let's go and sit down and sort this out, please, before you start shooting. Very few of us would do that. But if you understand that that is your responsibility, you have received a mandate to just go and do that, to go and do just that, then you do it. Then you do it. And I think the impact of this whole thing lies in the fact that a very specific and inclusive group of people have received the mandate not only at the national level, but also from their local community. They have received the mandate to take on this responsibility and to make peace or to intervene where it is necessary. And now, and this is the third last point, so I'm really almost done. But this is an important point. There is a strong correlation between the success of an LPC and the quality of expert support it has received. There are examples of LPCs who have completely by themselves and on their own initiative and through their own resources have done remarkable work. The Wajir Peace Committee is well known, and there are other examples where that happened. But they are the exceptions. On the whole, the task of a local peace committee is just too complicated, too complex for local actors to do it all on their own. They need support. and they need expert professional support in the art of facilitating difficult dialogue, in the art of mediating, and in the art of training people in these things. If you imagine again, if you think the situation at the local level, the high levels of trauma, the deep suspicion, the brokenness, the fact that you have to really heal a society from the bottom up, that is complex work. That is specialized work. And what I imagine, and I've said that yesterday where we have been discussing the case in Colombia, if this is something that the international community can do, if you can identify 30 to 50 people for a country like Colombia who have the aptitude, who have the personal credibility, and who have the knowledge and skills to play this sort of role, and you deploy them across the country to all the districts to give support to the local initiatives that are taking place, I think you will make a massive contribution towards the peace-building program in that country. Second last, the linkage that infrastructure for peace provides, the fact that the local peace committee is linked, gets its mandate from the top and is linked to the national structures. That linkage is very important because it gives the local people access to financial, bureaucratic, and political support right from the top where needed. In many cases, I've seen we get stuck here in a specific negotiation, and then we call on people at higher level, and they come down and they help us to unstuck, to break the deadlock that we had. So it's a very useful link to have. Lastly, LPCs are imperfect bridges, and this is the concept that Laurie Nathan used in an article that he wrote on local peace committees in South Africa. Imperfect bridges. And the image that comes to mind is of a river that comes down after heavy rains. The river is a torrent, and it sweeps away all the bridges across of that river. None of the bridges remain standing. But the two communities on both sides of the river are interdependent. They need each other. So now you construct this makeshift bridge across the torrent. And it is a rickety affair, it is fragile, it is flimsy, it is dangerous, it is everything that you can, it's everything but a sound engineered construction. But if it enables the most rudimentary contact and traffic between the two sides, it is at that moment performing a critically important job. So when we look at local peace committees, don't look at a state and a creation of statecraft that is going to meet all the requirements of statecraft. Look at what they are supposed to do, to be rudimentary, elementary mechanisms at a time of great crisis to help communities to take the first necessary steps towards social reconstruction. However, do note that in quite a number of countries, local peace committees are being institutionalized, where they get statutory status and the status of an alternative conflict mechanism, conflict management mechanism. We can talk about that if you have interest about that later on, but I think the important point at the note of imperfect bridges is where I want to stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andries. I think you've done a really masterful job of blending academic literature, policy directives, and kind of bureaucratic thinking and operationalizing, and really bringing it down to what it means to be in a zone of conflict that's struggling to deal with problems of violence. I remember when you first started at USIP, you came in one day and you said, "But I'm not an academic. Can I really write a book about this? I'm a practitioner. All I have is the experience that I bring to the table." And you have just done a brilliant job of putting it all together for us. So thank you very much for this book. Let's turn now to Chris Mitchell, who is a retired, or trying to retire. I think we've brought him out now 3 days in a row from his retirement, so I hesitate to say he's retired. He's an emeritus professor of conflict research at the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. He has, I'm sorry? Forget the rest. He's worked and taught all over. He's been a mentor for a generation of students in conflict resolution. He's been one of the real pioneers in our field, and we all owe a debt to Chris for his work. He's done a lot of work on local zones of peace, particularly in Philippines and Colombia, and we're delighted that he can be here. He's a longtime friend and colleague, and I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Jenny. Wait till you get my bill. When you get to my stage in life, you find that you are often doing things through obligation. You leave a sort of trail of obligations behind you, former students and colleagues and even former enemies. Occasionally you find yourself doing something for sheer pleasure, and that's what I'm doing this morning. I was delighted when Ginny contacted me and said Andrea wanted me to come and sit as a commentator on his book launch. The pleasure was intensified when I actually started to read the book. I'd seen some of the drafts earlier on, but I had really no idea of how it was going to turn out, and believe me, it is a wonderful book. It's a great book. It's, I guess, about 10 years now since people started to talk about infrastructure for peace, or peace architecture. And since that time, a lot of ideas have been floating around, a lot of aspirations have been loaded onto this concept. Local peace building suddenly became very fashionable, I guess, 5 or 6 years ago. But really there hasn't been any possibility of answering the question that was in fact posed to Andries in Nepal, which was, okay, give us something that pulls together some of the lessons that has been learned from practical experiences with developing local peace communities, local peace committees, whatever we're going to tell them. Well, the answer is now that there is somewhere you can go, and there is somewhere which is based upon enormous amount of practical experience. And Andries, as I said the other day, has actually lived the whole gamut of infrastructure for peace. I mean, he's been an architect himself of building up infrastructures. It's a very rich book. It's a great book in the sense that it raises all sorts of questions and answers some of them, but leaves others, open to the way of treating them. This is an important topic. We really don't know the answer to it. Let's think about it together and come up with some suggestions about, where we go from here. What have we learnt from various countries? How does it all fit together, etc., etc., etc. I can't possibly do justice to the book in how long have I got? 3 minutes?
Maybe
5 more minutes. Yeah, okay. Having tempted me out of retirement, yeah, give me 5 minutes.
Since you came all this way.
Yeah, right.
What do you need? Let's negotiate.
Yeah, let me just sort of take 3 things which I think struck me as I went through the book, and one of them's a sort of slight disagreement with Andries, but it's a disagreement that I think enables us to build on what he's put into the book and where it might go. And then I want to take a point where I think it slightly needs reinforcing because it chimed so well with my own experience and my own work. And then finally a question. My disagreement is really, I guess, it arises from, Andries has this neat little diagram, which I'm about to lose, where he sort of talks about the different environments in which local peace, they call them ejercicios in Colombia, exercises, get set up. You've either got a situation where at the national level, the elites are still going to carry on with the conflict. On the other hand, you have got a situation where the elites have actually agreed to a peace, so that you've got these sort of dichotomous environments at the national level. But then, of course, as Andries has pointed out, you've also got the local level to think about. So what happens when you've got, at the national level, the conflict continues, but some local people want to set up some kind of local agreement to keep the peace, to make the violence less? I think that's an interesting situation that I've been trying to look at. Andries is talking about where you've got an agreement at the elite level, actually, at least to stop the violence and talk about peace, or that there's a peace agreement in place. And the question is, how do you actually implement that at the local level? Have the local people agreed to there being peace? My suggestion is that it might be helpful to sort of complicate this a little bit. I was struck very much by Andries' example from his own country, from South Africa, where the local peace commissions were actually set up actually during negotiations for peace. So it seems to me that you're actually thinking about, or perhaps talking about, three situations, at least at the national level, which local people have to cope with. You've got the situation where the conflict rolls on, violence continues at the national level, which I guess is what is going on in Colombia at the moment. Then you've got a situation, hopefully, where there's a ceasefire at the national level, and the leaders, the elites, are talking about a final peace agreement. And then you've got the aftermath where the peace agreement has been made at the national level, the television cameras have been on site, people have come and emerged onto the balcony waving pieces of paper and announcing peace in our time. Well, what effect does that have locally? And it seems to me those are three really rather different situations. The one that I've been interested in is how do local people make peace while the protagonists at the national level are carrying on. Andries' book, I think, is largely about what happens when the elites have made peace, so-called, and how does. But there's this sort of intermediate phase where they're talking about peace, and what do the local people do at that particular point? And it seems to me that those are three slightly different situations, and they pose three slightly different sets of dilemmas for local people. What do you do if you want peace locally, but the war rolls on? What do you do at the local level while the elites are talking about peace? What do you do at the local level where people at the elite level have declared peace has broken out? Please, as Andries says, go back and live with people who've done appalling things to your community or your family or whatever. And it seems to me that there are three slightly different but very interesting variations. Secondly, Andries talks about, and has sort of talked about this morning, the fact that local peace committees, communities, whatever we're going to call them, that they have to deal not just with what I think the phrase that you use is the national cleavages, but with the local disputes, disagreements, conflicts, violence that gets plugged into that. And again, I think this is something which really needs reinforcing. I was looking again at the efforts to build up local peace communities in Mindanao in the Philippines just recently, and it was pointed out to me very forcibly by one of my students. You know, you often learn a hell of a lot from your students if you listen to them, who came from the Philippines. And he said, you know, the thing is about these peace zones that people are talking about in Mindanao at the moment is, yes, okay, they're peace zones from the point of view of the major dispute between the Philippine government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. But he said, you also have to deal with RIDO. And I thought for a moment, who the hell is RIDO? And he explained to me that he's talking about a culture which is a revenge culture. Right? And that if somebody does an injury to a member of your family, you are duty bound to repay that particular violence, wrong, by an equivalent violence and wrong. Now, what do you do about that when peace has been made eventually between the MILF and the Filipino government? That's still there. It has to be dealt with. Okay, my last point is really a question for Andries. And again, you know, I'm sort of interested in, you know, you talked about how do local peace committees get set up. How and when do they come to an end? What's the process of and I ask this because at ICAR at George Mason University several years ago, we had a very nice South African fellow who came, Rob Midgley, who had been working in the East Cape in Grahamstown with the local peace committee. And he wrote an occasional paper for us where he said, I think towards the end, he gave an account of how his local peace committee came to an end. That it became, the whole thing about the local peace committee was it became a rival to local civil society organisations and local political party organisations. And he was really very regretful about this because he said we had all of this experience of, you know, peacemaking, building, you know, providing a bridge, and it was lost. And he was really very sad about that. So there must be some way in which local peace committees can successfully morph into something else, which is still useful. And I'd be interested to hear what your reaction to is to that query. So, but wonderful book.
Thank you, Chris. I think you've given us some very provocative questions, and I think I would even toss out that we might want to complicate from 3 scenarios to a 4th scenario. If you have the conflict continuing at the local level, ceasefire at the top level, trying to work for an agreement and a national agreement, you might add a 4th one, which would maybe fall in the middle of having agreement being negotiated without a ceasefire, because I think that gives you an even more complicated scenario for the local peace builders.
What's happening in
and that's what's happening, and that's also what's happening in Colombia as well. You know, you have this agreement at you have an effort to reach agreement at the elite level, but at the local level, these local peace building groups are suffering a lot of threats and violence. Now let's turn to Jackie Wilson, one of my colleagues at USIP. I'm delighted that she's here. She's a senior program officer in our Academy for International Conflict Management and Peacebuilding. She has tremendous experience on Sudan, Africa, the Horn of Africa, somewhat in Colombia, Niger, Yemen, and Afghanistan. She's working on her degree, her PhD at Georgetown right now, and has much to bring to this discussion. So.
Thank you, Ginny and Lily, for the opportunity to be on the panel. And Andries, it's an honor. After a number of years after the initial discussion, and I think you'll see how you influenced some of my thinking and some of my work. So thank you. And Chris, also, I know I was thinking about Darfur and Sudan and some of your comments. So Ginny, I'll add a 5th, I think, or 6th complication, and that is the creation of a peace committee in the middle of a raging civil war. And that's the example of the, I guess I need the flipper, please. Thank you. Of the peace committee that I had the privilege of working with, it's a cross-border peace committee between Sudan and South Sudan. And just to give you a little bit of background, it's called the Meram-Warwar Peace Committee. Meram is on the north side of the border in Sudan, but was southern Kordofan or western Kordofan previously. And Warwar is a town south of the border in South Sudan. And the story is really fabulous. I'm working on a USIP publication that will tell it in more detail. But in the midst of the civil war, these Miseria pastoralists north of the border had found that access to their grazing was restricted because of the war. And also they were traders, and they couldn't trade their goods south of the border. So they had a very strong local interest in creating some mechanism to allow them to graze their cows and trade their goods. And they went to the border, sent a message secretly across in a milk bottle. It was sent to the SPLA commander south of the border, who accepted their offering. They crossed the border and they established peace markets. That's the short end of the story, short description of the story. And it turns out that that SPLA commander is now the governor of the state south of the border. So there's some really interesting linkages that continue from the middle of the Civil War. So local interests in that case really trumped the national level violence that was happening. The northern government essentially tolerated the peace committee. The southern government welcomed it, in part because they were able to have access to food and fuel. And there's this symbiotic relationship of grazing, which really facilitated the need for this. Just to show you where this is, the western grazing corridor here is just west of Abyei, which is very sticky for those of you who know Sudan and South Sudan. The interesting part here was also that the communities of the Western Corridor really mentally and physically tried to isolate themselves somewhat from the call of the national government to focus on Abyei. And so, again, it was a really interesting example of how local interests and needs trumped national interests. I was hoping to start a peace-building project where I would be working with the Peace Committee. You can just see that my first objective at the time was to build the capacity of the Peace Committee. In order to do that, I needed to do some of the things like assessing their legitimacy, their standing and effectiveness, find out where they fit into government, and you'll see in green there, they don't. And so after having spoken with Andries about the importance of this peace infrastructure, I found myself dealing with a peace committee that really was not connected in any direct way to a national infrastructure for peace. So then I thought, wow, okay, I think our work will be cut out for us. But in truth, through the course of the project, I did find many things that are consistent with Andries' findings and what you'll find in the book here, specifically the need to anchor peace at the local level. And I would say that I think Sudan, South Sudan, and Darfur in particular are examples that buttress that need. And you could say that the Darfur peace agreement's failure to have an impact relate directly to the fact that they are not grounded at the local level. And likewise, the comprehensive peace agreement between North and South Sudan had provisions that required local buy-in, such as demarcation of the border, such as identifying demilitarized zones or grazing zones along the border. And those really require the buy-in of local communities, but there were no real structures in place to ensure that that happened. And so again, I think that buttresses your point. And then also the convergence or the divergence between local and national aspirations. And I think that I mentioned that already. And I think just to go back quickly to that, something that I found was when you talked about the plug-ins of the local to the national. I think in this case, what's actually happening is the opposite, that on occasion, the national will plug into the local and try to stir up problems there. So it's just kind of almost the opposite. But again, local aspirations they want to plant their crops. That's why I put this picture of these new tractors that came to northern Bargazal. They want to have a growing season. They want stability. Very, very a focus on local interests. In terms of the infrastructure for peace, I went back and examined after reading the book. Essentially, there is very little. As I said, on the north side of the border, there was the state of Southern Kordofan, the state governor established a peace and reconciliation mechanism, which, as it was described to me, was essentially 10 former military men who would mediate disputes by locking people in the room, paying them off with some money, and not allowing them to leave until they reached an agreement. That was on the north side of the border. South of the border, there were requirements in the CPA. There was a national level peace commission and state level peace commission components. In the case of this particular state, they had 2 people in the office, 1 laptop. And so very rudimentary peace infrastructure, I think, in terms of capacity, resources, et cetera. The Peace Committee actually coordinated with the state level infrastructure in South Sudan, but not on any formal kind of basis. There was no sharing of resources. Really their benefit, and I think the reason they were allowed to remain effective and functioning, was because of their relationship with the governor, who was a very, very powerful figure in this particular state. So it's a very interesting dynamic in terms of infrastructure, standing, access, all of those things. But essentially, you had this peace committee functioning largely on its own. I was thinking that maybe it's a formal, informal hybrid, and I saw you reference that in the book. There was some formalized funding for a period of time. The peace committee was allowed to get fees from the sale of goods at the peace markets, so some taxes. But within the past couple of years, the legislature noticed that there were some fees for trading and sales at the markets, and they decided that those fees should go into state coffers instead of to the peace committee. So really they were left with no support other than some international NGOs that stepped in to try to support them. But they still maintained, they were able to have very robust deployments. They actually created subcommittees at key locations along the border. So as I mentioned, I had to really understand the role and status of the Peace Committee. There was so much more to be done there than I had the resources or the ability to do. There still is. But one of the things we did, trying to figure out what the Peace Committee actually did, what standing, what access, what credibility, what do they actually do? And so one of the activities we did that is shown here is I asked them to map out their response to a cattle raid. And so they could think of any particular situation that they had reacted to. And so the drawing is how they mapped out who they called, who they contacted, et cetera. And so they would describe things like how they would be, members of the Peace Committee or subcommittee would be notified of a cattle raid. And I would ask them how they responded. In one case, the guy said, well, I got on my bicycle and I rode 2 hours to the nearest police post because there was no cell phone network. They had no Thuraya, no scratch cards. They had a bicycle and, some energy, and that was how they responded. But it was clear to me that there was a commitment there to do something to keep conflict and violence from escalating in a very dangerous, fragile place on the border. This was actually the state level commissioner of peace in the place. One of the reasons I chose this picture is because I don't know if you can see Dinka, Malwal, and Rezagat peace conferences. There's a history of peace conferences in this area, and that's actually what I'm writing about for USIP in terms of publication. But much of the peace work was done in a tribal context. So a lot of these things, we tried to encourage, Meram Warwar Peace Committee as opposed to Dinka Missouriya Peace Committee, right? Because we had been told that tribalism is one of the challenges in terms of the effectiveness of the work. But then renaming things created other problems. So I think it's interesting, how you label a peace committee can have repercussions and impact. Louis, I looked at some of the functions that you have in the book, and they definitely did early warning. They participated in some formal structures, so they coordinated with what were called security structures, right? So But at the same time, when these cattle raids happened, the Peace Committee really demonstrated to me their access and standing, because depending on the situation, depending on how many people were killed, how many cattle were stolen, sometimes they would notify the SPLA, sometimes they would notify the police, sometimes they would notify the local chiefs. In other cases, they would call the governor directly, right? And so they had this analysis. It wasn't written down or documented, but they had an understanding of the risk of particular circumstances, and they knew essentially how to respond appropriately. So they definitely had this early warning, early response function. Social cohesion, I think less so. You know, we found people who had never met each other, and there was this distance, and I think that photograph really speaks to me. In one case, we saw them when they were under the mango tree in the center of the village and having conversations, and some outsider tried to speak, tried to interject, and his voice was quickly stifled, right? He was not allowed to contribute. Obviously, it was the role of the Peace Committee to make statements about peace and to control the conversation. So social cohesion, even within the village, even within the Peace Committee, was just not happening. They would say things like, "I've known this man for 40 years," and hug each other dearly. They had intermarriage, but at the same time, when they turned and walked away and we started interviewing them independently, they would bring up stories and narratives about horrific things that happened between their tribes, their communities during the war. And there had been no work on trauma, reconciliation, et cetera, on those things, yet they managed to continue working together. So I think there is potential in the Committee for Social Cohesion, but it requires a lot of effort. So this was kind of when they met each other, and because they hadn't seen each other in a number of years when we first convened them. So there were these very, very dear, relationships at a superficial level, I guess you would say. The problem of teeth, they really had no formal teeth, but I thought, again, this was interesting. They had a lack of support, especially from the government in the North. The government in the North gave the member of the Peace Committee, the head of the Peace Committee in Merrim, a truck, a Land Cruiser, which was very valuable. But other than that, there were restrictions on their access, restrictions on mobility. At one time, we tried to convene them from Merrim to Warawar, and the only way we could do that was for them to drive to Khartoum, and we'd fly them from Khartoum to Juba, and then Juba to Awil, and then Awil to Warawar. So, a distance that's this far on the map was really, they couldn't cross the borders safely, and the government was watching their movements and things. So they were really working against the national interests at the time. But at the same time, they had the access to the governor, and they had protection when they were south of the border. So very, very interesting dynamic again. But they really were not a consensus building body. I didn't see them as a dialogue body. It was really only those roles initially. The only teeth I think they had was their access, their credibility, their history, their standing with the communities, the violence that they had prevented. That was their teeth. Prerequisites of infrastructure. They now have a building rather than meeting under the mango tree. I kind of have mixed emotions about that because they're not as central to the community as they were. Specialized support. They definitely have a need for many, many types of support that they're not getting. And horizontal and vertical linkages are virtually impossible for them. So it's really quite an uphill battle. And this is just a picture about the lack of infrastructure. We actually had to rent 2 mango trees to hold a workshop under. So there's just a real lack of infrastructure in this particular area. And peacebuilding architecture, again, the positive thing, I think, is that there are few alternatives. And I think, the phrase imperfect bridges, I think, is what you mentioned, is really the case here, that there are no other bridges, or very, very few other bridges. The question is, whether they're interim, how long they'll last. They don't have the support. How credible will they maintain their credibility? And then representativeness. One of the things we found when we started identifying participants for different projects and different activities was, looking around who's in the room and who's not in the room. They were reaching agreements on grazing agreements, but they didn't really know where the cattle were grazing. And those people weren't in the room because they're nomads and they're, way far to the north out in the field. And when we started asking about women and traders and things like that, they had women elites, NGO representatives, but not women traders from the marketplace and not grassroots women. And they really didn't have religious leaders. And so somehow that representativeness, it seemed like they were almost self-appointed to this peace committee, and they generated it. It was their idea. The challenge was to help them see how adding some representation from different groups could make them more effective in achieving some of their goals. Elicitation, yes, was very important, but again, listening to them was very difficult. Gluing the shattered vase, it seems clear that they have not reached the level of reconciliation. We are able to discover some traditional processes and things that I could describe if we had time, but that are fascinating, but are not practiced anymore between these groups. And so what you find is kind of dancing, share a meal, and then that's the extent of reconciliation. So there's much more to be done. But to wrap up, the need could not be greater. These are the blue lines are the major grazing corridors across the border, and the yellow lines are the smaller grazing corridors. And so if you think about the potential for really understanding the power and the possibility of cross-border peace committees, I think it's tremendous. But there's much to learn. So I thank you for the contribution of this book in terms of moving that thinking forward. And then I just close with a quote: "Every day people are talking is the day that they are not fighting." So I think that's the great value of the peace committees.
Thank you, Jackie. I think you've given us a sense of kind of how this book can be useful in thinking about particular cases, and also the real import of the context and how the context matters for the shaping of these local peace committees. I just say two quick comments, and then I'll turn it back to Andries if he has some responses, and then out to the audience for those who want to ask questions. I think the first one is, Andries, your book really underscores the importance of the mandate. And I think you haven't said much in today's session about the nature of the mandate. These are mandates from national peace agreements that specifically specify something about local peace committees. Can you talk a little bit about what that something is, what the variations are? Is there kind of standard language that's been inserted and adopted throughout the world? I know there were, I think, 16 or 17 agreements when you were here that had local peace committees that had been mandated. There are probably many more by now. I haven't been following it since you left. So if there's anything to update. And I think another question I have is, you underscore the importance of technical expertise. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where does that expertise come from? Is it generally from within the society? Is it UN agencies that have developed this capacity that are going around and providing training? And in relation to that, in your own experience in South Africa, did you come up with a kind of guide or manual for establishing and the functioning of local peace committees? And is this a resource that's available? Is it out there in different languages? Is it out there to be translated by somebody who says, yes, this would be great to have? So with that, and many other questions, but I'll talk to you later and open to the floor after.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much to both of you. Jackie, thank you very much for taking this to Sudan. You know, this is it's quite a place to take the book to. And I don't know of anything in Sudan that comes out exactly the same way as it went in, but it's but it's thank you for testing it. And just a very special word of thank you to Chris Mitchell. You know, he's not only the one of the parents in the field of conflict resolution. He's really, when I came into the field, he was one of the scholars on the field. But in addition to that, he is one of the few serious scholars working on local peace building, and he has been doing that so for many years. So it's really getting a tap on the back from you, Chris, means incredibly much. So thank you very much for that also. Just as far as the questions are concerned, let me start with what you said, Jenny, because I think it ties up a little bit with also the question that you asked, Chris. Every peace agreement gives a different mandate. Examples, in South Africa, the National Peace Accord, under whose auspices we worked, the mandate, a very clear mandate, and that mandate was prevent violence, because at that time the escalation of violence in South Africa was beginning to undermine the prospect of a negotiated outcome. So the peace accord was basically not an accord on political substance. It was an accord that says, while we are negotiating, this is how we will behave in order not to ensure that there will not be violence, and these peace committees will have to monitor that, and they will have to ensure that there is no violence while we are negotiating. So that is a very specific mandate that was given to the South African peace committees. And then, of course, the moment when the agreement therefore was reached, the agreement was made, the need for the mandate actually has lapsed, because the objectives have been achieved, and the objective was a negotiated outcome. In other cases, in Northern Ireland, for example, the mandate was policing, the transformation of policing. Again, a very specific objective that was given, and I think we are at the stage now in Northern Ireland where possibly the local bodies there have also outlived their usefulness. And could be retired. What we do find, and this is the interesting thing, is where the mandate is becoming a permanent mandate. And we find examples of this in Ghana and in Kenya. Malawi seems to be working in the same direction, where the assumption is that there is need for such a function in our society, a facilitation, mediation function. And pretty much like you have ADR in the court systems here in many states in the United States, where before you go for take your intended divorce to court, you first have to go for mediation. And only when mediation fails, then you can go to... So it's that sort of arrangement that we have in Ghana, for example, that when there is community conflict, that conflict, there is the local peace committee must first deal with it, and only when that fails, then the court system can take it up. So in that case, it's in law now. It's a statutory. They have become a statutory body. So they have been institutionalized. In other cases, it's more difficult because things are so fluid. Ken Menkhaus wrote a very interesting article on the peace committees in northern Kenya, where he felt that the state of state failure is so severe, government cannot actually govern anymore there. But the peace committees, and this is what you are talking about, Jackie, the peace committees seem to be capable of still doing some law and order control there where no one else can really do anything. And the question is, what is the state building role there? And Tanya Chopra also wrote a couple of articles in this case. Are peace committees not usurping now the role of state building?
Yeah.
And this is clearly an interim, one of those interim situations where nothing is perfect, nothing is as it should be. Nothing is conforming to textbooks. It's just such a free-for-all in a sense, and his theory is that these peace committees is a hybrid form of government that will possibly evolve, if it evolves in the correct direction, into something that will lead into more of a governance function. So it's a question that is really wide open, but I think every single peace agreement gives very specific peace-building mandates that have to be achieved, and the role of the local peace committees are very much tied up to those mandates that have to. They normally have a sort of a general provision, promote reconciliation and all those nice good things. But there are very specific objectives in many cases. Then, as far as the technical expertise is concerned, Jenny, the short answer is no. And I'm not sure whether there should be a manual. I'm a bit hesitant about it. You may remember that in my proposal to come here, I in fact said I'm going to write a manual. And fortunately, everyone forgot about that.
I had forgotten too.
A manual is a very tricky thing because a manual works a manual that will work in South Africa is definitely not going to work in Sudan. One that works in Sudan is not going to work in Nepal. I think it's more about the type of training, and John Paul Lederach talks about this elicitive training and this contract between trainer and trainee, where you share. And where that training is in a sense also a form of dialogue, where two worlds meet, but with a very specific objective of bringing new knowledge and new skills into that setting, but in such a way that it touches ground there. It is not. So I think that is the type of training that needs to take place. I know there are many handbooks out there, but to my mind, the more important thing is whether there are enough people out there who can provide this type of training to potential experts who have to go and support these. So that's the situation. I hope I've noted your amendments to the table, which in fact I got from Chris Mitchell. He kept quiet about it, but that very neat little distinction is he enlightened me to it. But I think it's important that it is growing and that it's becoming more complex, because that is indeed how. And it's correct. It's absolutely correct that there are intermediary situations that should fit in here.
Thank you so much. We'll open to the audience. I'd ask you to identify yourself and your institution if you have one.
My name is David Loudon, and I recently finished my MA in National Security and Conflict Resolution. And I certainly understand and appreciate the thinking on manual. So I would ask, can you point to any tools in the toolkit that might benefit the work with the idea of improving objectivity and promoting dialogue? And have you noticed any common catharsis needs that help, again, push that effort further to a benefit ending, a beneficial ending?
Shall we take a series of questions and then just...
I'm Dolly Castaneda, and I research on Peacebuilding. And I have two questions. One of them is, which are the links between the local committees and the local authorities? Because, well, when the state is broken and you don't have local authorities, well, there's no relationship, and they just take the space that normal institutions should take. But when you actually have local institutions like a judiciary system, an ombudsman office, and majors, some of them are related to armed actors, but others are not directly related, and some of them are actually working for peace. So which is relations or the linkages with these committees that you seem to fix with them? More civil society, including political parties, but not institutions. So how do you work with them? How is like the long-term process for institutionalizing the local peace committees with these institutions that are already in place? And the second question is, what about the development? The development development dimension on this. Because one of the things that people after war are really worried about is livelihood. So if more than human rights and all these things are very important, and the rebuilding, rehabilitation, and everything, but there is a very natural thing of how I'm going to survive after war. So what is this dimension of development and really answering to these humanitarian and more long-term development questions that people are having?
Any other questions? We're not going to have time for a long discussion, but I think if we can get the questions out on the table, that would be useful. Yes.
My name is Zadik Badal. I'm from Nepal, and I have the bitter experience working with this bureaucratic way of building peace, remaining in the local peace committee in Kavre district. I agree with you, Andries, what you raised here, what we practice in Nepal. I think you are the one consultant who helped the Ministry of Peace and Reconstruction in Nepal, I think in 2007 around, I'm not sure. But I agree in a point that we mostly practice in a bureaucratic way rather than like having much discussion in the community at the community level. But what I learned working in LPC is how should we incorporate these stakeholders like the government sector, even in the local administrative office, like what you mentioned is CDO, and at the national level of the ministry. Even if it would not be ministry, the government organization. One way to other, the LPC needs resources, no matter whether that is human resource or the financial resources. Without resources, the LPC cannot function. And at the same time, we have to, maintain a good relationship with the political parties and the other civil society. But in Nepal, what happened is no political party, like they look at the civil society organizations or civil society members as free and fair. They found that one way to other, each of them are clandestinely supporting one party. So there was no trust between the political parties and the civil society. So how should this mechanism, local peace committee or local peace mechanism, should incorporate these all sectors in one, so that it would have an effective impact to the people living at the community level?
Andries? I think we're going to give you the final word. You can choose to address some of these, or maybe afterwards those who have asked the questions or who have more questions can have time to talk with you.
So should I respond to this?
Well, either respond or just final word. Respond in your final comments, or
Yeah. So our time is actually up.
our time is over. But
Okay.
I wish we could extend longer.
Yeah. Now, let's meet afterwards. I would love to talk to you about Nepal. Just a quick response to the relations with local authorities. The whole idea is that in this peace committee, local authorities and the police should also be represented on the local peace committee, which makes it an ideal platform for coordination. Because one of the problems, you will remember it was said yesterday also, one of the problems is this disjunction. You have all these ministries and so on having to do stuff, and they don't coordinate. And this is a platform where people can coordinate, where if you have that mandate, you can bring them together. But the idea is that the district, the officials, and the police should really be very much part of this discussion here. However, when decisions are made, it is the local government that must make the decision, not the local peace committee. Local peace committee can facilitate some form of dialogue. The decision has to be made by the local government. Local peace committee can have a discussion around how to prevent violence. It is the local police who have the mandate to act, not the local peace committee. So it's important to I think it's a difficult distinction that we have to maintain, and people struggle with this, but to my mind it is an important distinction. And yes, we know that conflict and development are closely linked, but there are no examples from all the examples that I saw where there was a deliberate link, with the exception of South Africa, a deliberate link between local peace committees and development. That link has not been consciously made.
Okay, with that, I think I have a couple of thank yous to give before we depart, and then I'll let you go. I just wanted to acknowledge the role of the JR Fellows Program in putting together this program, and in particular the director, Lily Cole, and Kelly McCone, who has been her assistant, helping to get you all here. And I want to thank as well the USIP Press, which published this book, particularly Valerie Norville, who heads the press, Kay Heckler, and Paula Burke, who also have done a lot of behind-the-scenes work to get this book published and to have it available here. So I'd like to say a word of thanks to them. And I'd like to thank you all for coming, and thank Andries for a wonderful presentation, and Chris Mitchell and Jackie Wilson for their commentary. It's been a very, very rich discussion, and I look forward to it continuing outside the confines of this room. Thank you.